The year is 309 BC, now 14 years after the death of Alexander the Great. The Antigonids' failure in the Babylon War would result in the loss of the East. Nevertheless, Antigonus remained in the zenith of his power, and after returning to Syria, aimed to relaunch the war against the Western coalition, resulting in a decisive battle which would forever change the course of history. In 315 BC, Ptolemy had sent his brother, Menelaus, with an army to the island of Cyprus. And now, 6 years later, the final garrison of Citium would submit to Ptolemaic rule. The island served as a critical junction and provided a great staging ground to launch raids against both Asia Minor and the Levant. In 309 BC, Ptolemy personally commanded a fleet which would capture several coastal towns in Lycia and Caria. He would even strike as far as Greece, where he took possession of several Greek cities before returning to Egypt the following year. When Antigonus arrived back in Syria, it soon became evident to him the danger the island played if it remained in Ptolemaic hands, though he feared the intervention of Cassander and advised that he would first have to turn his focus to the Aegean. Antigonus would send the bastard son of Alexander the Great, named Heracles, and his mother Barcine to his former ally Polyperchon in the Peloponnese. He hoped the old general could use the last of Alexander's heirs to raise support for a revolt against Cassander. However, Cassander would convince Polyperchon to side with him, and subsequently the young man and his mother were killed. With Antigonus's diplomatic attempt to undermine Cassander having failed, he would be forced to rely on his military capabilities. In 307, Antigonus would send Demetrius to Greece. Demetrius's campaign was incredibly successful. He managed to regain control over the Nosiotic League before making an unexpected landing in Attica, where he managed to capture Athens after the city populace expelled Cassander's garrisons and his governor Demetrius of Phaleron. When Demetrius entered the city, he was recognized as a liberator and a god. The Athenians reinstated their democracy and immediately pledged loyalty to fight alongside Antigonus and began rebuilding their navy. In the subsequent aftermath, much of Greece would revolt against Cassander. Demetrius's campaign had been a masterstroke. Cassander had been significantly weakened, and it would take him 4 years to reorganize his Greek territories. Cassander was now unable to come to the support of Ptolemy, who would have to bear the brunt of Antigonus's assault. Antigonus's first goal was to take the strategically important island of Cyprus. If he could capture the island, it would be both a devastating blow to Ptolemy's prestige, as well as prohibiting his ability to launch raids into Asia Minor. In the spring of 306, Demetrius, under order from his father Antigonus, would set sail from Athens. He would be accompanied by 30 newly built Athenian quadriremes. Crossing the Aegean, Demetrius made for the coast of Caria, where he called upon the Rhodians to join him per the terms of their alliance with his father. The Rhodians, however, who maintained good relations with Ptolemy, refused. Going on to Cilicia, he would be reinforced with an army sent to him by Antigonus, before crossing into Cyprus. Demetrius's army now consisted of roughly 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. He was accompanied by a fleet numbering 53 heavy ships and upwards of 110 lighter vessels. He was opposed by Ptolemy's brother Menelaus, whose army numbered some 12,000 infantry, 800 cavalry, and roughly 60 ships. Demetrius landed on the Carpathia Peninsula on the northeast of the island and established a fortified camp. From there, he began raiding the area and captured the towns of Carpathia and Urania. Leaving his fleet there, he then marched on land against the city of Salamis. Menelaus, after receiving the news, would move his army to confront Demetrius in a battle about 5 miles from the city. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Menelaus's army lost nearly 1/4 of their strength and was forced to retreat behind the walls of Salamis. Following the battle, Menelaus hastily made ready for a siege of Salamis and sent messengers to his brother asking for aid. Demetrius then brought his fleet and blockaded the port. After a few days of continuous attacks, Demetrius's siege engines finally opened a breach in the wall, and his subsequent assault nearly proved decisive, only being stopped by the onset of nightfall. In the meantime, in response to his brother's appeals, Ptolemy himself had sailed from Alexandria at the head of a grand fleet, numbering 140 warships and over 10,000 men on 200 transports. The previous day, he had arrived on the western coast of Cyprus, and now Ptolemy attempted to make a night dash around Cape Greco to Salamis, hoping to surprise Demetrius and combine his fleet with his brother's 60 ships. Demetrius, however, informed of Ptolemy's arrival, took steps in order to prevent this from happening. He sailed the bulk of his fleet to anchor outside the harbor, positioning himself between the two enemy fleets. Demetrius concentrated the bulk against Ptolemy, leaving only 10 ships to blockade the narrow exit of the harbor of Salamis and prevent or at least delay Menelaus's intervention. This meant that Demetrius took a calculated risk, hoping that he would be able to defeat Ptolemy before Menelaus could sail out of the harbor and attack him in the rear. As Ptolemy's fleet came into view of the city the next day, they found Demetrius's fleet deployed and waiting for them. Demetrius had gathered his best ships on his left flank and transferred command of the fleet to Medius of Larissa, although Demetrius remained present on the left flank. Ptolemy quickly matched his fleet to mirror his opponent's dispositions. He ordered the transports carrying his army to fall back and massed the largest ships of his fleet on his own left, which he commanded in person. When the two fleets were about 3 stadia apart, both Demetrius and Ptolemy raised the signal to attack, and the two fleets charged each other. The battle would carry on for hours, but in the end, both Demetrius and Ptolemy's left wings would prove victorious. But Demetrius managed to break through first. He quickly turned his ships and collapsed on the Ptolemaic center. By the time Ptolemy turned to do the same, he found the rest of his fleet already defeated and in flight. Menelaus's 60 ships, meanwhile, had managed to break through Demetrius's blockade, but only to find the battle already lost. Demetrius's fleet had only lost 20 ships, while Ptolemy's fleet had lost over 80. More importantly, Demetrius's forces had captured 40 of Ptolemy's warships intact, as well as over 100 transports with 8,000 troops on board. Following this defeat, Ptolemy retreated to Egypt, and Menelaus was forced to surrender Salamis and its garrison. The fall of Cyprus further increased the Antigonid strength. When the news of the victory at Salamis was brought to Antigonus in Syria, he would proclaim himself as king, since the Macedonian throne had laid vacant since the murder of Alexander IV of Macedon by Cassander several years earlier. At the same time, Demetrius was raised to co-king alongside his father. Antigonus's assumption of the royal title was soon followed by the other dynasts. After the naval battle of Salamis, Ptolemy's realms were nearly defenseless. His entire navy was lost, and his army was significantly weakened. Seizing the opportunity, Antigonus would recall Demetrius's navy and plan to march on Egypt. Antigonus's large army was reinforced by Demetrius's, while Demetrius would remain in command of the navy, carrying the supplies and shadowing the army along the shore. The plan was excellent, and Ptolemy was weak, but as they neared Egypt, weather conditions became terrible. Storms prevented the navy from approaching Egypt, depleting Antigonus's army of much-needed supplies. By the time the massive army reached the easternmost tributary of the Nile, near Pelusium, they saw Ptolemy was waiting for them on the other bank, preventing a crossing. Instead of risking the same fate as Perdiccas 15 years earlier and finding another crossing further upriver, he elected to withdraw from Egypt without a fight. For now, Ptolemy was saved. Although Antigonus's and Demetrius's invasion of Egypt had failed, Ptolemy was seriously weakened. Seleucus was occupied in the eastern satraps, and Cassander was still struggling to restore order in Greece. A new attack on Ptolemy or Seleucus seemed unwise. Therefore, he decided to attack the distraught kingdom of Cassander. Before they could launch a full-scale invasion, they aimed to capture the island of Rhodes. The Mercantile Republic possessed a large navy and controlled the entrance to the Aegean. If Rhodes fell, the Antagonids could strike upon the Macedonian heartland at will. Demetrius arrived on the island in 305 BC. Demetrius brought with him an army of roughly 40,000 men, whilst the Rhodians had a force of 6,000 citizens, 1,000 foreign soldiers, and an unspecified number of slaves. He first built his own harbor alongside the original in an encampment for his main army. The city and the main harbor of Rhodes was strongly fortified, and Demetrius was unable to prevent supply ships from running the blockade, allowing the Diadochi to help supply the Rhodians with supplies and fresh troops. Capturing the harbor was Demetrius's main objective, though his several attempted attacks would result in very little, and he would ultimately be forced to resort to an overland attack. His army ravaged the island and built a huge camp next to the city, but just out of missile range. Early in the siege, the Antagonids managed to breach the walls, and a number of troops entered the city, but before they could make any meaningful gains, they were counterattacked, and all were either killed or captured. Demetrius subsequently didn't press the attack, allowing the Rhodians to repair the walls. The citizens of Rhodes were successful in resisting Demetrius. After 1 year under orders from his father, he was forced to abandon the siege and signed a peace agreement with the Rhodians in 304 BC. The Rhodians promised that they would be loyal to Antigonus and Demetrius and would support them against all their enemies except Ptolemy, who was given the name Soter, meaning savior, for his role in the siege. In the propaganda of Antigonus, the siege was presented as a big victory, though it is generally considered a half success. Nevertheless, they had achieved their initial aim, as Demetrius was now able to fight a war against Cassander in Europe. In the autumn of 304 BC, Demetrius would depart for Greece. Since 307, Cassander had managed to re-establish control over much of Greece, from where he would continue south and besiege Athens. Though now with the arrival of Demetrius, Cassander would be forced to abandon the siege and withdraw back north. Demetrius continued to liberate the Greek towns. He won over Corinth and almost the entire Peloponnese, organizing a league of Greek towns similar to that founded by Alexander's father Philip. The towns were to be free and autonomous. Demetrius was to be their general and had the right to conscript soldiers for their army. At this point, Cassander worried that if Demetrius invaded, it could ultimately destroy his power in Macedon. In 302, he sued for peace, though Demetrius and Antigonus had been very successful and were convinced that they could defeat Cassander. Cassander subsequently held council with Lysimachus, and they agreed on a joint strategy that included sending envoys to both Ptolemy and Seleucus, asking them to join in combating the Antagonid threat. Seeking to take the initiative, Cassander sent a significant portion of his Macedonian army with Lysimachus, which was to be used in an invasion of Asia Minor. Meanwhile, Cassander took the rest of the Macedonian army into Thessaly, intent on confronting Demetrius and halting his advance. The two armies would meet near the old town of Halos. Both he and Demetrius would fight a war of nerves. The two armies would build large camps and watched each other, but did not join battle. In 302, Lysimachus crossed the Hellespont, intending to take advantage of Antigonus's absence in Syria by overrunning Asia Minor. Upon entering Asia, he would storm the coastal city of Sicyon, after which most of the region of Troas would submit to him, except for the major coastal city of Abydos. While he besieged the city, he sent Cassander's general Prepolus with an army to attack Ionia. Demetrius, who was still in Greece, was able to reinforce the defenders of Abydos by sea. Lysimachus, realizing his inability to properly blockade the city, would be forced to abandon the siege. He would continue to advance to Dascylium, where, after capturing the provincial capital, would gain control over most of Hellespontine Phrygia. From there, he would march his army south, capturing the major administrative center of Cynida. On the coast, Prepolus had managed to capture much of Ionia, before finally moving inland and capturing Sardis, another major administrative center. When Antigonus received news of the invasion in his newly built capital of Antagonia, he quickly began the march northwards from Syria. Lysimachus, hearing of the approach of Antigonus's army, held council with his officers and decided to avoid open battle, hoping to delay until the arrival of one of his allies. When Antigonus arrived and offered battle, Lysimachus's troops remained within the camp. Antigonus therefore moved to cut off his provisions, forcing Lysimachus to abandon the camp and make a night march some 40 miles north. There, the allies built a new, triple palisaded camp amongst the hills, with relatively easy access to food and water. Antigonus followed closely behind and laid siege to the camp. With the siege works nearing completion and food running low, Lysimachus once again decided to abandon the camp and marched away during a nighttime storm. Antigonus again attempted to follow, but as winter approached, with further rain, conditions became difficult, and he abandoned pursuit and dispersed his men into winter quarters. Lysimachus's army marched into Bithynia and went into winter quarters in and around the city of Heraclea. Meanwhile, in the east, Seleucus in 305 BC had launched a campaign against Stasanor, which had resulted in his complete subjugation, adding the rich lands of Bactria to his already vast empire. From there, he had received news the Marians, under their great emperor Chandragupta Maurya, had invaded and annexed the territories along the Indus. In an attempt to secure his eastern flank, Seleucus would launch a campaign which regained him control of most of the land west of the Indus. From there, he would cross the river and attempt to campaign into the Marian heartland. Though his campaign would fare poorly for him, and upon meeting the army of Chandragupta, the two leaders ultimately reached an agreement in 303 BC. Seleucus agreed to abandon the territories along the Indus, stabilizing his eastern border and obtaining 500 Indian war elephants. Seleucus could now come to the aid of his allies, turning his attention against his great western rival, Antigonus. While settling his army for winter, Antigonus received the news that Seleucus was en route from the eastern satraps to support Lysimachus. He therefore dispatched messengers to Demetrius, ordering him to bring his army to Asia to reinforce Antigonus's troops. Demetrius thus hastily arranged a truce with Cassander and took his army by sea across the Aegean to Ephesus, from where he marched north to the Hellespont, before also dispersing his army into winter quarters. In the absence of Demetrius, Cassander now felt able to send further reinforcements to Lysimachus under the command of his brother Plistarchus. Since Demetrius was guarding the easy crossing points at the Hellespont in the Bosphorus, he attempted to ship his men directly across the Black Sea to Heraclea. The men had to be sent in batches due to a lack of ships, and although the first batch arrived safely, the second shipment was intercepted by Demetrius's fleet, and the third wrecked in a storm. Plistarchus himself narrowly survived the wreck of his command ship, eventually being carried to Heraclea to recuperate over the winter. The concentration of Antagonid forces in Asia also made Ptolemy feel secure enough to bring his army out of Egypt. He captured a number of cities in the southern Levant, but while laying siege to Sidon, he was brought false reports of an Antagonid victory and told that Antigonus was marching south into Syria. He thus garrisoned the cities he had captured and retreated back into Egypt. At around the same time, Seleucus finished his march from the east, arriving in Cappadocia at the head of his army, which he now sent into winter quarters. As spring began to bloom, Antigonus and Demetrius would concentrate their forces near Cynida. Lysimachus and Seleucus, anxious to bring Antigonus to battle, would do the same. The armies eventually met 50 miles northeast of Cynida, near the small village of Ipsus. Both sides deployed their troops in the standard Macedonian formation, with the phalanx of heavy infantry in the center. In front and to the sides of the phalanx, light infantry were deployed to act as skirmishers, with elephants intermixed between them. The cavalry was split between the two wings. In the Antigonid line, Demetrius commanded the best cavalry, stationed on the right wing. Antigonus, with his personal bodyguard, was positioned in the center. Seleucus' son, Antios, was in command of the cavalry on the left wing, which was traditionally the weaker wing, intended only to skirmish. Since Seleucus' deal with the Indian Emperor Chandragupta added roughly 500 war elephants to his army, compared to the Antigonid 75, he vastly outnumbered them in this department. Instead of placing them all in the front line, he retained a large tactical reserve in the rear, under his own personal command. The battle began with a clash of the elephants from both sides, with neither army able to gain the upper hand. Demetrius then launched his attack, maneuvering his cavalry around and attacking the allied cavalry under Antios. Despite Antios' best efforts, Demetrius, possessing superior quality and numbers, would quickly win the confrontation, routing the allied left wing. Demetrius, hoping for a decisive victory on the right flank, pursued the routing allied cavalry. Seleucus, realizing his opportunity, quickly moved his some 300 reserve elephants into Demetrius' path. By the time Demetrius broke off his pursuit, he realized his cavalry was now isolated from the battlefield. The effect of elephants on horses, which are alarmed by their very smell and noise, would have prevented Demetrius from taking his horses through the line of elephants, and maneuvering around such a large quantity of elephants was impossible. The Antigonid and allied phalanx engaged in a stiff and chaotic fight, though with Demetrius now isolated from the battlefield, the Antigonid phalanx was exposed on its right flank. Seleucus now detached part of his cavalry from the allies' own right wing, including horse archers, who could rain down missiles on the immobile phalanx. With the exposed flank of the phalanx now being exploited, the morale of the Antigonid troops collapsed, and most of the infantry now either defected to the allied side or routed. Antigonus, stationed in the center, tried to rally his men, hoping for Demetrius' return. However, he was gradually surrounded by the enemy infantry and eventually killed. With the death of their commander, what was left of the Antigonid battle line routed. From the wreck of the Antigonid army, Demetrius managed to recover 5,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, and escaped with them to Ephesus, from where Demetrius would immediately set sail for Greece, trying to preserve the remnants of his rule there, and abandoning Asia to the Allies. Since Ptolemy had withdrawn from Syria when he had heard the false report about the Antigonid victory, he was not granted anything. Instead, Lysimachus and Seleucus divided up Antigonus's Asian territories between them, also granting Cilicia and Lycia to Cassander's brother Pleistarchus for his part in the campaign. Although Antigonus was firmly defeated and dead, Demetrius still retained control of a large part of the Peloponnese, and still had ambitions of a conquest of Macedon itself. And in Asia, a new conflict was about to arise. Ptolemy had long claimed Syria and the Levant, but after the Battle of Ipsus, the province had been granted to Seleucus, and over the next 2 centuries, the two dynasties would fight for control of the region in what became known as the Syrian Wars. I hope you all enjoyed the video. I truly love making these, and am constantly working to try and improve them. If you enjoyed, please leave a comment and a like, as it really helps my video out. I also plan on making series covering the subsequent struggle for Macedon, Pyrrhus, and the Syrian Wars. If any of this sounds interesting, please consider subscribing. Thank you.